All right, so we should be recording. And so we've got critically appraising evidence presentation out of the way. Now I'm going to go into the source use and citation setbacks presentation. And I really don't have any idea how long this presentation takes because it's formerly a presentation that I did for NU596 Graduate Seminar 1, and it was just recorded, so you had to listen to it on your own and listen to the recording, and I'm not sure that's still the case anymore, if it's still used or not in Graduate Seminar 1, but because of the problems, well, actually, before I get ahead of myself, so in this presentation, I just wanted to go over secondary source citation, present some examples of source citation setbacks that are related to secondary source citation, and give you some examples of solutions. The background being the problem introduction assignment for this course. The instructions included the following two instructions. You were to begin with an introduction of the practice problem in its general context beyond the proposed local project setting, and briefly define that problem, who it affects, risk factors, incidence, prevalence, and relevant consequences, such as like physical, psychological, or social, economic impact. And then any claims that you made in your description of that problem should have been supported with claims from current relevant evidence from credible primary sources. Okay, well, one of the things I noticed right off the bat, which prompted me to not grade that particular criteria on the assignment and just give everyone the points for it, was that claims were not being supported with evidence from primary sources. And I know students might think, well, I did get this from a primary source, this particular evidence, but something to keep in mind is that sources might be both primary sources and secondary sources. In other words, you might have just a second, I'm struggling with my technology here. Sources such as journal articles that are primary sources of information are nearly always also secondary sources of other information. They start with an introduction of the problem, and the researchers cite other sources when they describe the problem, and they will include a literature review where the researchers look at previous similar studies that have been done and identify gaps in the literature that led to the need for the study that they're reporting in the article. But the primary source information in a journal article that happens to be a report of a single study is the information that's reported in the results section. And then the discussion section can also be a primary source of information because it will contain the researchers' original conclusions about what their study findings mean and what they imply for future practice and research. But I'll just reiterate that journal articles that are primary sources of information are nearly always also secondary sources of information. So it's okay to use their primary information in your work, but it's not okay to use their secondary information. So just because the source is a primary source of some information does not mean you can use the secondhand information it contains in your own work, unless, it's impossible, or, there are some circumstances where that would be okay. But if that's the case, then you have to format that information with a secondary source citation. Okay, so although the use of information from a secondary source in your paper is a problem in and of itself and should be avoided, a related problem is use of information from secondary sources without properly citing the information and giving credit where credit is due. Okay, so a source is a secondary source of any information that has been credited by the authors to other sources. So use, and sorry, I flipped forward again. Use of information from secondary sources should always be avoided, but when it's necessary, secondary source citation is required. Okay, so rarely is it impossible to obtain the direct source of information or the primary source of information you have come across in a secondary source of that information. If the primary source is published in a language you can't read, or it is out of print or otherwise unobtainable, then it's acceptable to cite the information secondhand. Secondary source citation technique is described in the APA manual. So, and it's section 8.6. It's a very short section. It tells you how to format a secondary source citation. But in any case, I want you to avoid that unless it's impossible to do so. Okay, so you need to recognize secondhand information in your sources. Avoiding the secondary source citation requires that you do that and make sure that information that's been credited to other sources will be, or you should be able to see that the information that's credited to other sources is going to be denoted by a citation. All right. And that citation style is going to be determined by the editorial style the author used to write the publication. Okay, and there's different citation styles. In this course, or in nursing school, you're required to use APA editorial citation style, but many scholarly sources use different citation styles, such as superscript numbers that correspond to entries in a reference list at the end of the source. They can also be bracketed numbers. There may be other citation styles, but APA style uses the author name in parentheses accompanied by the publication year, and then if it's a quotation, the page number, although you can use a page number or locator even if you're paraphrasing, but it's required when you quote. Okay, so that's just something you should be aware of when you're reading a journal article. If you're seeing superscript numbers or bracketed numbers, those are probably citations. Okay, just because you don't see parenthetical citations with an author name doesn't mean that there aren't any citations. Okay, so the rest of this presentation is going to consist of examples of source citation setbacks and advice for avoiding them. But first, I just want to emphasize one last time that secondary source citation is a source citation setback that can and should be avoided. And if the secondary information in a source is important enough to include in your own paper, then it's worth the time and effort to just find the primary source so that you can get the information directly from it for use in your paper. Okay, and as we go through these examples, it'll probably require some reading on your part, and I will be reading too, just to make sure we get the gist of the examples that are included here, and then how you would avoid the problem, and also how you would identify the problem. So in this is actually a fictitious example. I'm saying a student wrote this, but I don't know why I keep bouncing forward. The slides might be advancing on their own. So the student wrote, Bakshi defined fatigue as an abnormal sense of tiredness or lack of energy out of proportion to the degree of effort or level of disability that significantly interferes with routine physical or intellectual functioning. Okay, so that was a quotation from page 219 of Bakshi's article. Bakshi also wrote, fatigue contributes to the morbidity associated with MS, which is multiple sclerosis, by limiting energy and endurance, and by adversely affecting mood, outlook, and ability to cope with accompanying symptoms. Also quoted from page 19. Okay, so then keep with this in mind, we go to the next slide. Now this is actually a clip from that article. So it's a clip from the introduction of Bakshi's 2003 publications. Okay, and the clip says, you know, fatigue and multiple sclerosis is defined as an abnormal sense of tiredness or lack of energy, out of proportion to degree of effort, disability, significantly interferes with routine physical or intellectual functioning. And then we see a superscript 1 there. So we know that this first sentence, I think I must have had this slide presentation set up on a timer to automatically advance the slides, so I apologize for that. So we know that this first sentence is being credited to a source by Bakshi. So if we were to look in Bakshi's reference list, we would see what that source was. Thus, MS-related fatigue is unusual and abnormal. et cetera, et cetera. Another source citation, number 2. Excessive fatigue is one of the most common and disabling symptoms of MS. And you can see this paragraph here is a typical problem introduction. The author, Bakshi, is introducing the problem of fatigue associated with multiple sclerosis. Okay, so these are the typical moves you would make to introduce that problem. Okay, we've got some in 65 to 97% of MS patients have fatigue, so we got the sort of the prevalence of fatigue, and 15 to 40% describe fatigue as the most disabling symptom of MS. So these are all things that help demonstrate the significance of the problem. All right. So if you think back to the previous clip, or if you have the handout and you can take a look at it, moving to the next clip, we got to ask ourselves, what's the problem? Well, for one thing, the writer's quoting excessively, but there's another problem that I'm more concerned about. Anytime you have 2 quotes back to back like that from a source, that you should think that maybe you're quoting too much. 1 quotation per page, depending on the preference of your instructor, would be probably all the quotes you should include in a paper. Some instructors would prefer that you not include any quotations at all. Okay, so anyway, I wanted you to notice the superscript 1 at the end of the quoted information. Okay, the superscript 1 indicates that source 1 in Bakshi's reference list is credited with the idea, and also indicates that the student quoted the idea secondhand from Bakshi's article. So if we go back to that slide, okay, so this quotation, this is what Bakshi wrote in the article, but it happens to be quoted from this part of the problem introduction, and there's a superscript 1 there. So the information in Bakshi's article, Bakshi's probably getting this information firsthand. So this information is based on a primary source from Bakshi's point of view. But from the student's point of view, source 1 is a secondary source in Bakshi's article, because the student does not have source 1 and is not reading source 1. Bakshi had source 1 and read source 1 and was able to quote from it. So that superscript 1 indicates that source 1 in Bakshi's reference list is credited with the idea, and also indicates that the student quoted the idea secondhand from Bakshi's article. So hopefully we're all on the same page here. Okay, whoops, going back. Let's see. Oh, sorry, we were supposed to go forward. All right, so this is the reference list entry for source 1. Okay, so first note, this is what it corresponds to. So this is who Bakshi cited when stating that information about MS. Okay, so then the solution. So the student wrote this. Bakshi defined fatigue as an abnormal sense of tiredness or lack of energy out of proportion to the degree of effort or level of disability that significantly interferes with a routine physical or intellectual functioning. The solution, this is what Bakshi, or this is what the student should have written. Bakshi, 2003, citing Weinschenker et al., 1992, defined fatigue as an abnormal sensation. Okay, so this way we're giving credit where credit is due. All right. By putting the secondary source citation in there. However, that's still a weak, awkward strategy. It would be better if the student had simply found another primary source of the evidence, or maybe a more recent source, or gone and found the Weinschenker et al. Article and gotten the information directly from it. Okay. So note, even though these examples feature quotations, if the student had paraphrased the information, the secondary source citation would still be an issue. All right, because you'd still, even if you're paraphrasing, you still need to use secondary source citation formatting if you're citing a secondary source or citing a source indirectly through another source. Okay, So keep that in mind. So whether you quote or paraphrase, if the source you're quoting or paraphrasing credits the information to other sources, then you're quoting or paraphrasing secondhand information, and secondary source citations required. Or better yet, you should go get the primary sources and get the information from them yourself. All right. All right, so this example, this again is from, these are clips from the Bakshi article showing other information that's been credited to sources. So just take a look at these two pieces of text, and I'll try to keep up with the automatic advancing of the slides. All right, so take a look at those, and then we're going to look at what the student wrote, or we have to refer back to what the student wrote. So the problem is that the superscript numbers 10 and 11 indicate that Bakshi has borrowed the information from sources 10 and 11 in his reference list. So secondary source citation would be required on the part of the student. However, again, it would be better for the student just to get the primary sources and cite that information directly. Okay, now these are the two sources denoted by the superscript numbers 10 and 11. So this information could be used by the student to obtain the two sources and get the information directly from them. Okay, so that's one good thing about a reference list, is you can always use that information to obtain those sources yourself, so you can read them yourself and get information directly from them. But you should also consider, you know, how old are those sources, and maybe there's more current primary source information available, because diseases and things change over time, and their incidences and prevalences change, and the risk factors change. And so you always want to make sure you have the most current evidence. So simply getting the sources cited by the source you're actually reading may not solve your problem of needing to have current evidence from primary sources. Okay. So then the next slide. So here's a solution. The student wrote this. Bakshi also wrote fatigue contributes to morbidity, etc. So the solution would be to do the secondary source citation technique, which again is awkward, albeit correct, and not a good academic or scholarly strategy, because you should get information from primary sources, or direct sources. All right, so the next example. This is just another solution based on this quotation. It is believed that fatigue contributes. So this is just where the secondary source citation gets incorporated into the end of the sentence, or it's a parenthetical citation rather than an in-sentence citation. Okay, compare that to the previous example and you'll see what I mean. And there's two types of citations. You can have an in-sentence or narrative citation, and then a parenthetical or end of sentence citation. All right, so then here's setback 2. The student wrote this: the treatment of SAD, seasonal affective disorder, with bright light therapy was first proposed by Rosenthal and is the treatment most encouraged by the medical field today. And the student credited Eastman, Young, Fogg, Liu, and Meaden with that fact. Now, of course, today, given the 7th edition, we would just write Eastman et al., because you don't have to include all the authors. If there's 3 or more authors, you can use et al. On the first citation. All right, well, that information is based on this highlighted information. This is from the source text here. Supplementation with bright artificial light is therefore logical and is also the medically recommended treatment of choice. So with that in mind, what problems do you see? Okay, the treatment of SAD with bright light therapy was first proposed by Rosenthal and is the treatment of most encouraged by the medical field today. It's based on this information. So you should be noticing the superscript numbers here indicating that Eastman et al. Have credited sources 5 and 6 in their reference list with this idea. Okay, so what's the problem? Those superscript numbers indicate that a citation has occurred, and these happen to be This is a clip from the reference list. These happen to be the two sources that were credited with that idea. That treatment is most encouraged by the medical field as bright light therapy. Okay, so the solution then is to use secondary source citation, which I've done here. Only this time it includes two sources, Rosenthal 1993 and Oren and Rosenthal 1992 as cited in Eastman et al. Again, better to just go get the information from primary or direct sources. Okay, so here's the third setback. This is what the student wrote, Ferner and Aronson. Here's an error right here. We should have a and instead of an ampersand. Define a medication error as a failure in the treatment process that leads to or has the potential to lead to harm in the patient. And that's based on the source text here. We have therefore proposed the following definition of a medication error. A medication error is a failure in the treatment process, that leads to or has the potential to lead to harm to the patient. Okay. So, and that the authors here, Ferner and Aronson, have credited source 11. And here's an example of a bracketed citation. And this is source 11 in Aronson and Ferner and Aronson's reference list. Okay, so with that in mind, okay, the definition in the previous setback is enclosed in quotation marks, and that is, and there's the bracketed number indicating that Ferner and Aronson quoted source 11 in their reference list, and then the bracketed number 11 corresponds to the reference 11 in the reference list of Ferner and Aronson's article. So this is how you should handle the secondary source citation situation here. All right, now I want you to pay attention to what I did with the quotation marks, because when you quote a quotation, you have to make some adjustments to the quotation marks. And in this case, you have to change the quotation marks around what you quoted to single quotes, and then you have to add your own double quotation marks around that. And my suggestion is that you should always avoid quoting a quotation, okay? Because you might as well go get the primary source and quote it directly. And it just gets messy and awkward to quote a quotation. So my suggestion is just to avoid it altogether. And avoiding that would be easy if you had the primary source. And then I want you to notice how and is substituted for the ampersand. So in a parenthetical citation of a source, you use an ampersand, whereas out here in the in-sentence citation, you use and, not an ampersand. All right. And then the quotation marks are the issue. I pointed that out already. One other thing I wanted to point out was that Ferner and Aronson's, the student has quoted Ferner and Aronson's 2006 quotation of the definition from their 2000 publication. So, I've already mentioned that student's quoting a quotation, so you should avoid that. So never mind. All right, so then the notes about that setback are that, use an ampersand inside parentheses only and avoid quoting a quotation. But if you must, you have to change the double quotation marks to enclose the quotation that you're quoting to single quotation marks, then enclose the quoted quotation marks in double quotation marks. And this is actually information from the 6th edition of the APA manual, but the rules themselves have not changed. So I just need to update the section of the APA manual where those rules came from. So just keep that in mind. You could easily look up quoting in the index of your 7th edition APA manual to find out how to deal with quotations. Okay. All right, so here's setback 4A. Student wrote that the symptoms associated with SAD often include carbohydrate craving and weight gain, fatigue, and hypersomnolence. Okay, and student credited that information to Terman and Ross. Again, in 7th edition style, you would just write Terman et al. along with, and then there's going to be more here. So along with depressed mood, and then cited Lamb et al. I just wanted to go back to the source text. Okay, so here's the source text from Terman et al. Artificial bright light therapy for seasonal affective disorder alleviates the depressive and reverse neurovegetative symptoms, carbohydrate cravings, and weight gain, fatigue, etc. Credited to source one. Source one happens to be Rosenthal and Sachs. Okay, and others. Okay. And then this is the part of the source text that matches this part of what the student wrote. So symptoms of seasonal affective disorder include depressed mood, profound lack of energy, hypersomnia, hyperphagia, and carbohydrate craving, and weight gain. Source two, in this instance, matches to Lamb's article about seasonal affective disorder, how to diagnose and manage it. Okay. So what are the problems? The obvious problem is the use of secondary source information without properly formatting it as secondary source citation. The author of the source text have credited the information to other sources, but the student only credited the information to secondary sources, ignoring the sources that were cited by the authors the student actually credited. So credit was not given where credit was due. But a more serious problem is that what the student wrote consists of, that's so frustrating. What the student wrote consists of the exact words from the sources typed verbatim or word for word as they appear in the source text without enclosing them in quotation marks, which is a form of plagiarism. Okay, now you might think that that's not plagiarism because the student cited the source, but when you use the exact words from a source, you have to tell readers that you're quoting by using quotation marks, or if it's a really long quote, like greater than 39 words, then you've got to set it off in a block and then cite it, include the page number as well. So when you use the words in exact sequence or nearly exact sequence from a source without formatting them as a quotation, it's still a form of plagiarism, whether you intended to do that or not. Okay. All right. So again, get the direct sources and then check, let's see. This is just what I would recommend, like for things like diagnoses, especially mental health diagnoses. Probably the best place to get that information, or what would be an acceptable primary source, would be the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Okay. This source would be an acceptable source of a definition and symptoms of a psychiatric disorder. So that's a solution for that particular setback. Okay. So then, just to reinforce what I've already said a million times, get information for academic papers from primary sources. And if it's impossible to avoid using secondary information in your work, in other words, it's impossible to obtain the primary source, or the primary source is written in a language you don't read, then you should use secondary source citation formatting to cite the secondary information. And that way you'll make sure that you give credit where credit is due. Okay. And all right, and then here's setback 5. This is what the student wrote. Patient expectations are oftentimes a predictor of the outcome of interventions used. It has been documented throughout the research that patients who have favorable opinions of phototherapy can greatly influence how successful bright light therapy versus other interventions will be. And that's all based on this information that's been highlighted in this particular clip from the source text by Lamb et al. Go back. Okay, so kind of look at those things and compare. And then I'll move to the next slide. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the paper does not accurately represent the intent of the authors. Okay, so it's not this time that we have necessarily not formatted borrowed words as a quotation, but the way we've presented the information is not an accurate representation of the authors. The authors were discussing the meaning of the results of their study. They were not referring to what has been documented throughout the research on the problem, and they did not assert that patient expectations are oftentimes a predictor of the outcome of interventions. So I'm not sure if there was another source that the student intended to cite, but again, these are fictitious examples, but in any case, the result is misrepresentation of the source. The student has credited the authors of the source for ideas that they did not assert. So there's a kind of a different problem. It's you want to make sure that when you paraphrase or quote from a source that you do so accurately, and that you do not make it look like the author said or wrote something that they did not write or say. Okay. And the other thing is that the use of the terminology throughout the research on the problem, that's kind of a clue to readers that there should be the citation of multiple sources that would follow a claim like that. So if you assert that there is evidence throughout the literature about a problem, then citing several sources of that evidence or possibly a systematic review is necessary in order to warrant that claim. Okay. All right. And then here's a solution. Here's the solution example. Based on their study findings that patients with seasonal affective disorder rated their expectations for light therapy higher than they did pharmacological therapy, Lamb et al. Concluded that it was necessary to control for their participants positive expectation effects of light treatment. Okay, now if you compare that to the highlighted information, we have a more accurate representation of what Lamb et al. Actually wrote. Okay. I think we're getting close to the end here, and then we'll do questions. All right, so here's another setback. According to Alzheimer's and dementia, women are more likely than men to have Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, and the 2008 estimate is that 2.4 million women and 1 million men age 71 and older have dementia. And then the next slide is going to have additional evidence. But for now, I want you just to compare what the student wrote to the source text on the right-hand side of the slide, if it will not jump forward. And note that the student has credited some facts about Alzheimer's disease to an institutional author called Alzheimer's and Dementia, but the source text is actually the 2009 Alzheimer's Disease Facts and Figures, which was published by the Alzheimer's Association. Okay, so that's what the source is, but the student has made it sound like the author is Alzheimer's and Dementia. All right. So then this slide provides the footnoted citations of the 2009 Alzheimer's Disease Facts and Figures that the student cited. So something to consider is that both the 2010 and 2011 Alzheimer's Disease Facts and Figures publications were available at the time the fictitious student's paper was written. So really the student should have gotten a more current source to cite. Okay, so that's another consideration, is always try to get current facts and evidence, particularly for health problems that change over time. Okay, so the basic problem then is that the author first is not Alzheimer's and Dementia, it is the Alzheimer's Association. And then the second problem is that paraphrasing is insufficient. Okay, so insufficient paraphrasing is a form of plagiarism. When you paraphrase information from a source, you have to substantially change the words so that you use basically your own words to convey the same idea. And if you use too many words from the source text, then it becomes plagiarism. Okay, and then a third problem is that the Alzheimer's Association has credited the facts and figures to other sources, as indicated by those footnoted citations on the previous slide. And lastly, the most current available facts should be cited. So information in the 2009 Alzheimer's Disease Facts and Figures publication may no longer be relevant, and there might be more current facts and figures that should be cited. Okay, so the solution then, this is, and it's a weak solution because it uses the secondary source citation. So according to Alzheimer's Association, citing Plasman and all, dementias such as Alzheimer's disease are more prevalent in women than in men. Furthermore, the Alzheimer's Association projected that in 2008, 2.4 million women and 1 million men over age 70 had dementia. So, and that's all based on information in here in the Alzheimer's disease facts and figures. So the weakest solution then is to use secondary source citation to give credit to the source cited by the Alzheimer's Association. But the most ideal solution would be to obtain the facts and figures from the primary sources, regardless of the sources of the information. Sufficient paraphrasing would need to be accomplished in order to avoid plagiarism. Okay. Setback 7 then, student wrote that music can be used to modify environmental stimuli, and some types of music may create neutral environment to mask noise and prevent overstimulation, in which can decrease agitated behaviors in older people with dementia. Credited to Dewey et al. Let's say, now this is the source, and the author of the source is actually Dewing, not Dewey. And you can kind of just compare those two. And you know the drill at this point. Compare what the student wrote to the source text in the second column and see what problems you can identify. And I think you get the gist, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So again, we've got secondhand information being used, but it's not properly documented as such. And the author is misrepresented by having his or her name misspelled. Okay. So the solution then would be something like this, and it's a weak solution because I have incorporated the secondary source citation in here. Let's see, towards the end. A stronger solution then would be to get the information from primary sources and get relevant research reports that Dewing does not cite. And read reports and get the evidence directly from them. Okay, here's a variation. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, no. This is just a new setback. So what the student wrote was, according to McGognall and Kenny and Schutte, dementia is an acquired syndrome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a long quote here, and it's based on this source text from the article by McGognall, Kenny, and Schutte. And again, here you could just write McGognall. Oh no, I guess it's two authors, so you'd have to cite both of them. So et al. Would not be an issue. And this is the last example, so bear with me. So again, compare it to the source text. And then here's the problem. We've got information omitted from the quotation without explanation. We've also got secondhand information use that's not properly documented as secondhand information. So if we go back to that example, if you read dementia is acquired syndrome consisting of progressive deterioration, global intellectual ability that of such severity that interferes with social and occupational performance. Oh, okay. So what did the student do over here in this quotation? It's okay, except for they omitted the American Psychiatric Association, and they omitted Hendry, 1998. So they omitted the citations. I don't know, for whatever reason, to disguise the fact that they were citing secondhand information or quoting secondhand information. I don't know, or just because they didn't know any better. But in any case, what results is you've got an inaccurate quotation by omitting those citations that McGogdall and Schutte included in their article. And anytime you omit information from a quotation, you have to tell readers that you did that by including ellipsis points. So the authors could have done that, but they still would have needed to indicate that secondhand information was being quoted, and they would need to credit those sources for that information by using secondary source citation. Okay. So information was omitted from the quotation without explanation. Again, the secondhand information was a problem. So here's an example of how you could remedy that situation. We just include the citations in the quotation, and you'll notice here that in brackets I added information, Alzheimer's disease, because anytime, assuming this Alzheimer's disease had not been previously defined as an abbreviation, AD, in the student's paper, at this point you need to define it for readers. And so it's permissible to add information to a quotation to like define an abbreviation, or to add words that make the sentence flow smoothly and grammatically. And anytime you add information to a quotation, you need to denote that by enclosing those words in brackets for readers. So that tells readers that these words were not part of the original quotation, but I had to add them because I had to define this abbreviation for you. Okay. In this case, by including the citations in the quotation, you don't really need to do any secondary source citation formatting, because it's obvious to readers that you're quoting something that contained citations. All right, so not a real strong solution, because I mean, the best thing would be for the student to not even use this quotation, because you shouldn't quote, I mean, because it contains citations, and maybe go get information from primary sources. All right. So we'll actually, you can post questions in the questions discussion forum, but I can go over questions now anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and end the slideshow. And again, I apologize for the automatic skipping forward of the slideshow. And I'm just going to put our agenda back up here. Okay, and see if we have any questions. None so far. Oh, here. Oh, Leisha had to leave. And Mary, thanks too for the detailed feedback on the problem intro assignment. It was very helpful. You're welcome. Yeah, and the problem intro assignments, I did give you feedback on APA style and all those issues that I think were, some were just issues related to the transition from 6th to 7th edition, but a lot of the issues were things that hadn't changed from 6th to 7th edition. And so I gave feedback on that extensively, but did not take off points, and also did not take off points for citation issues, but yet was not able to give feedback on those for most students. The first couple of students I was giving feedback to, but when I realized it was going to take me a really long time to grade the papers, I just stopped giving feedback on the source use. And so that's why I did this source citation and source use setbacks presentation tonight. And I think what was happening is that students would have, they would have a primary source of information about the intervention piece of their PICO question, and they were getting information to describe their problem from the introduction of that primary source. Whereas the authors of that primary source of research evidence about the information were crediting other sources for their description of the problem. And so essentially, some students were using another author's description of the problem to write their own description of the problem. And that inevitably leads to secondary source citation. So I think if I were to actually take the time to go through and analyze everyone's source use in the problem introductions assignment, that's what I would be finding. Is I would be finding a lot of instances where students were using the introduction of an article to write their own introduction of a problem, which is not a good strategy. It won't lead to use of primary sources in your problem introduction. Okay, so Mary asks, what are the biggest APA crossover issues you are seeing? You know, I think probably people still including the running head on their papers, and you don't have to do that anymore for student papers. And probably that continued use of citing all the authors' names instead of using et al. Because now, you know, it used to be that any source with 3 or more authors, you had to, any source with 3 to 5 authors, you had to cite all 5 authors the first time you cited that source in the paper, and thereafter you could just cite the first author followed by et al. Well, in the 7th edition now, any source with 3 or more authors, you can just cite the first author followed by et al. So that was one. Oh boy. Actually, I'll open up that APA crosswalk document, and that will help me, I think, identify some of the APA crossover issues that occurred. It really wasn't, there wasn't a lot to do with the crossover issues. Oh, here was one though. DOIs now, whereas they used to be included in reference list entries just as DOI typed lowercase followed by a colon and then followed by the DOI number. Now you're supposed to use the URL format DOI. So that was a common problem that I saw. So yeah, now, and if you don't, it's probably worthwhile for me to, I'm gonna show you crossref.org. Some older journal articles do not have DOI numbers assigned to them, or they don't have them printed on them. But if a DOI number has been assigned to the article, and often it has been retroactively, you can go to crossref.org, and I'm actually going to just go back out here and show you how to do this. So I just type crossref.org. Whoops, I didn't mean to type that dot in there. And then you want to click this search metadata tab. And then you can just copy and paste the title of the article into this field. And then, shoot, I wish now that let's see, I'm going to do, I'll look up my own article. Oops. There. Okay, so here's my article that I wrote, and you can see right here, it's got the DOI number right here. So you can look up any article, and if it has a DOI assigned, you'll be able to copy it. And I just like put the cursor right here at the end and then drag. Oh, shoot, sometimes you gotta be careful, you'll end up going to the article. Drag across it, hit Control-C, and then you can copy and paste it into your reference list entry. So that's a pretty handy thing to be able to do. And then I'm going to bring that. You know what? This recording is going to get really long, so I'm going to stop recording and then restart the recording. That way, I'll end up uploading 3 recordings, but they won't be so huge that it'll be hard for me to upload them. So I'm going to stop.